just wanna love you, just wanna hold you.
This is an audio-visual story of a heart-wrenching tale set in the 18th century. Get ready to embark on a journey of love, sacrifice and heartache of the unbreakable bond of true love. Episode 7. When the Heart Feels Anger. Charlie arrived in England and made his way to the home of George the doorman. On arriving at the house, Charlie was greeted by George's wife. "My dear Master Charlie, it is so good to see you after all these years." "Hello, Beth. It is good to see you as well, even if for a little while I need to speak with George," replied Charlie. "He is with his brother at the White Swan Inn." Charlie thanked Beth and proceeded to the Swan Inn, which was only 2 streets away from the house. As he walked in, he could see George sitting by the fireplace with a beer in one hand and his pipe in the other, talking to his brother. As Charlie walked up to the table, George looked up. "Bless me if it isn't Master Charlie. When did you get back and—" "Why?" "I had to come back on business," replied Charlie. George then turned to his brother and said, "Jack, fetch Master Charlie a whiskey, and for us as well. Sit down, sir, and tell me what brings you to see me." "Remember, on the day I was leaving, you told me that my mother had found something that could bring down my father, but no one knew what it was or where it was, as she died a few days after telling you and Uncle Carl," replied Charlie in a sort of half-excited, half-anxious voice. "That I do, Master Charlie. I only thought it was right that you knew your mother was seeing your father for what he is, the devil walking among us." Charlie then pulled out the document from inside his coat pocket and passed it over to George, who opened it, then took one quick look, folding it back up fast, and said, "We need to take this to someone who will know what to do." They got up just as Jack returned with the whiskey. "Hey, where are you going in such a hurry?" "Sorry, Jack. I need to take Master Charlie to his hotel, and I think you can manage to drink all 3, replied George, laughing. They then left the Swan and made their way to the captain's hotel. Once inside, George asked if they could let the captain know he was there. They were told to go up to the captain's suite. George knocked on the door, and John opened it and asked them to come in. "Gentlemen, this is Master Charlie, Edward's brother," announced George. "Good to see you, Charlie," said Carl. "It's been a long time, my dear uncle," replied Charlie. "Sir, remember your cousin before her death mentioned a document that could bring her husband's money plan down, and we didn't know where it was. I have in my hand that very same document," said George in an excited voice. "Where in the devil did you find it, George?" remarked Carl. "It was not me, sir, but Master Charlie who found it in the base of an old vase. He has travelled from Hong Kong as he knew how important it can be," replied George. Charlie then began to explain what had happened and how he found the document. George passed it over to the captain, who began to read, and at the same time was almost jumping in the air. "We have got more than enough to not only destroy Lowings, but to have him hanged at the gallows. But again we need to play this powerful hand we have been given wisely, to make sure he does not slip away from justice." The captain then passed it over for Carl to read with John. At that moment, Isabella walked into the room and said, "What is all the fuss about? Why are you looking so happy?" "Miss Isabella, we have a surprise for you. Oakfield may soon be back in your hands," replied the captain. But before Isabella could say anything, Charlie stepped forward and introduced himself to Isabella. "My dear Charlie, I have heard so much about you from Edward, and how you have always protected him when he was a small child," said Isabella. Charlie laughed and said, "It has been Edward who has been looking after me for many years now." "Would you like to take Edward and George into the parlour, Miss Isabella, so you can catch up on what has been going on, the other side of the world?" asked the captain. Charlie, George and Isabella entered the parlour and closed the door behind them. The captain, Carl and John sat down to work on their next move to bring that devil Sir Arthur Lowings to his knees. It is now November 26th, and Sir Arthur and everyone from his gentlemen's club are waiting at Oakfield Manor for the arrival of the King of Spain any day now. Sir Arthur has many proposals to show the king and all to benefit Spain, himself, and everyone in the gentlemen's club, but mainly benefiting Sir Arthur. Pete Turnbull was making sure everyone knew their role in the meeting and not answering questions from the king unless told to do so. It was midday, and Sir Arthur had still to come down from his room. Turnbull knocked on Sir Arthur's door, and he heard a voice say, "Come in." As he stepped into the room, Turnbull found Sir Arthur sitting on the floor, surrounded with paper. "Is everything all right?" asked Turnbull. "I can't find the document for the shipping manifest for Cuba," replied a very agitated Sir Arthur. "It is with all the other paperwork ready for the king to sign. said Turnbull, looking very concerned. "I must have been overdoing everything. I'm beginning to forget what I'm doing. I had better be at my best when the king is here, or we may lose our heads," laughed Sir Arthur. In the kitchen, Mary was very busy making sure everything was prepared for the king's visit. She had extra staff to help her with everything, and nothing was being left to chance by Sir Arthur. He wanted everything to be perfect for the king. Sir Arthur and Turnbull entered the study to have one last meeting before the royal guest arrived. The meeting was going well. Sir Arthur was in a good mood, which made it easier for the others to relax and not worry about upsetting him. It was 2:15 when one of the bank's runners arrived at the house with urgent news. Pete Turnbull was passed a letter by the runner and began to read. He almost dropped to the floor when he read the news. Turnbull rushed to the study, made his way to Sir Arthur and said in a shaking voice, "The Spanish king is dead." Sir Arthur looked up and laughed, then asked if had Turnbull been drinking. "No, sir, the king died yesterday, and we have just received the news," replied Turnbull. Sir Arthur fell back into his chair and said nothing, not even when the room erupted with everyone wanting to know what was going to happen, as everything was planned for the king's visit. Some men were demanding their money back, and others began to leave the room. All the while Sir Arthur just sat in his chair, with his head in his hands, and said nothing. It took a few minutes for Sir Arthur to react. He slammed his hand on the table, then in a loud voice said, "One setback and you panic and scurry away like rats from a sinking ship. You all seem to have forgotten. We still have Colombia and the Caribbean in our grasp. Pull yourself together and sit down so we can work on a new plan for making us rich and more powerful than ever." One by one they returned to the study and sat down. Pete Turnbull brought the others who left the room back and told them to sit down. After everyone settled down, Sir Arthur began to tell them, with or without the king, they could still make part of the plan work, together with the plan to obtain coffee, sugar, and gold. "Lord John, have you still got your contacts in Colombia and America?" asked Sir Arthur. "Yes, and I have a man we can trust in Cuba," replied Lord John. "Excellent. Now we can work on the cargo of sugar while Spain is grieving over their king. Send the ships out with the trade goods. Write a letter to your man in Cuba, explaining exactly what I tell you, and send it with the ships. You need to make sure the cargo will leave for Cuba on the next tide. They are ready to leave England at any time," asked Sir Arthur, turning towards Turnbull. "Yes, sir, they have been on standby, ready to set sail for the last 4 days," replied Turnbull. "Excellent. Well, gentlemen, we are ready to make history and get very rich by doing so," said Sir Arthur, feeling pleased with himself. The room erupted with applause and cheers. It shows that no matter what setbacks there are, when it comes to money, people will forget any problems they had, because greed and power will always walk hand in hand. Carl was in a meeting with the British Prime Minister at Buckingham Palace. They were talking about the situation with Sir Arthur, and how he has and is using the government and the Bank of England for his purpose. They were making sure they had everything in order to present to the Queen. There are things such as this, the Queen would like to know, as it involves the Empire and matters of the state. It also looks bad to the rest of the known world if England allows its members of Parliament to twist the law of England to their own needs. The two men had been talking and working out the best way to deal with Sir Arthur for an hour when Prince Albert walked into the room. Both men stood up and greeted the prince. "Gentlemen, I can see you are busy, and I can only guess it's an important one by the look of all the documents," remarked the prince. "It is a most difficult situation we are trying to solve before presenting it to the Queen," replied the Prime Minister. "Indeed it must be, as I have never seen the two of you working together before, which reminds me, my mother wishes to see you in her library, Prime Minister." As the Prime Minister left the room, Carl asked the prince if he could spare a moment to discuss a personal matter regarding Oakfield Manor. On hearing the words, Oakfield, the prince suddenly had a look of contentment about him. "Ah, those were happy times. I spent many summer days with my friend Henry Oakfield. He was more like a brother to me. The mischief we used to get up to, I remember his older sister Margaret, and at the time I was besotted with her, which is silly now I think about it, me being a small child and her being almost a grown woman. How life and times fly by." Carl proceeded to tell the prince about the ring and what had happened to Lady Margaret, and about the house, and how the ring is now in the possession of Isabella. The prince listened very carefully to everything Carl had to say. Then when the captain was mentioned, he sat up and moved forward from his chair and said, "If the captain is involved, then it must be of great importance. As for the other matter regarding Oakfield Manor, I will honour the meaning of the ring, and as for Lady Margaret's brother's daughter Isabella, she has nothing to fear. She will be the Lady of Oakfield, of that you have my word." It was then that Karl handed the prince the letter Lady Margaret had written to Isabella, and also showed him Lady Margaret had written to the prince in the same letter. After a few minutes of reading the letter, the prince looked up and said, "As you probably know, I am in a way connected to Oakfield, so when I can, I wish to make an informal visit soon. Your Highness, you may do as you wish after we find the best way of dealing with this Arthur Lowings." The prince agreed with Karl that it would be better to deal with this quietly and not cause a scandal. The prince was about to leave the room when he turned and said, "This Lowings fellow, did he make his son look like he had betrayed the Queen and the nation by trading without an agreement with Spain?" "Yes, Your Highness, and by making his son a wanted man, it meant that the government could control his money and estate, or I should say, Edward's father could. I'm beginning to see this Lowings is pure evil, especially when he is using his own family for his greed. Has that man no soul?" replied the prince. "No, Your Highness, he has been called the devil who walks among us." "Devil or not, he is still a man, and any man who will stoop to such low levels for himself and greed will be punished, if not in this life but the next," snapped the prince, who turned and left the room. Charlie and Isabella were visiting Hyde Park before Charlie set sail in 2 days for his trip to Hong Kong. "So both you and Edward came here to talk and enjoy some time together?" asked Isabella. "Yes, we have always come here to watch nature and the people going about their daily lives. We have been since Edward was small after Mother died. She used to bring us here to observe people and teach us the meaning that not everything is about money, but being happy with what you have," replied Charlie. "Your mother was wise and loving. I can tell just by the smile on your face, Charlie, that they were happy times for you," remarked Isabella. "They were the best times for Edward and myself because we had time to be with our mother for a few hours once a week," said Charlie with a touch of sadness on his face. Charlie then lifted his head and with a big smile on his face asked Isabella in a cheeky voice, "So Isabella, tell me how and why you got married so fast after meeting Edward," said Charlie, grinning. Isabella smiled and said, "I can only tell you that when the heart knows the bond is true, there is no reason to wait. It was Lady Margaret who suggested we get married on the ship. We were going to wait until we arrived in England. As it turned out, Lady Margaret had other ideas, and Edward saw no reason not to get married on the ship. As for me, I just knew I wanted to be with Edward for the rest of my life." "There is one thing I still don't fully understand. Why did Edward not want anyone to know about the marriage?" asked Charlie. "Edward agreed with Lady Margaret that for the interest of both of us, it would be better not to mention anything even to his father, until Edward had placed all his plans for the future in place, and Lady Margaret had made arrangements for us to live at Oakfield," replied Isabella. Charlie then clapped his hands and said, "Now I understand Lady Margaret must have known about Lord Kemp's daughter and Edward." "What do you mean, Edward was going to marry Lord Kemp's daughter?" asked Isabella. "No. Our father had a dinner party with the intention of announcing the marriage, but Edward would have none of it and walked out on father and out of the room," replied Charlie. "That is what Lord Kemp meant when he said Edward is an honourable man by doing what he did. Lord Kemp was referring to the dinner party," said Isabella with a big smile on her face. They then sat talking for another hour before going to lunch and then heading back to the hotel. The captain and John are busy making a list of all the members of Parliament and the Bank of England who invested in Sir Arthur's money and power plan and who were not in his gentleman's club. They are the weak links and can be pressured to back out. As for those in Sir Arthur's elite club, it has been advised to leave them alone by order of the palace. The Queen wants them to be brought to their knees with quick justice, no matter their title or rank. The palace and the Prime Minister have given the captain and Karl complete control to achieve justice in the name of the Crown. "We will start with these members of Parliament. They have the most to lose and not just money," said the captain. "We have all we need on those from the bank. It will be easy to have them back out. 3 have large debts and no money, and the other 2 have used their family's money to invest in the land in Norfolk. So we will offer them the same amount they invested. In return, they will back out of the plan," said the captain. "I have a list of all of those not in the gentleman's club that we can bring together at the same time to present our proposal, to back out of Sir Arthur's plans," replied John. "Good. Now we need to inform Karl and arrange a meeting with everyone in the same room. I see the total is 15. That is going to work in our favour, especially having Karl there to explain what will happen if they don't. That will scare them into giving up their interest in Sir Arthur's plans," explained the captain. Edward and the professor were sitting on a log outside by the hut, talking about what could happen in England regarding Isabella and the captain, when Billy walked up to them and asked if they knew they were being watched. Edward shook his head, but the professor looked at Billy and held up 4 fingers. Billy nodded. Good. He hasn't managed to gain any more support. It has been almost 3 weeks since the attack. That is plenty of time to find more men. I think he is planning his next move carefully, and he will have to make his move in the next few days. How the hell? Did you know he was watching us and that he was not alone? Asked Edward. The professor gave a slight smile and said, I knew someone was watching us when one night I was sitting here around 2 in the morning last week, and I got a strong smell of cheap cherry pipe tobacco. And as far as I know, there is only one place in the world that sells that tobacco with that sickly sweet cherry smell, and that's Hudson's Imported Tobacco Shop by the docks in London, replied the professor, who went on to say, It was the next night I went around to the top of the hill and watched 2 of them watching the hut. I stayed until I saw the one who shot you, and another local man change places with the 2 who were watching during the night. Once I saw him, I knew there were only 4 of them, but was not sure if I had missed anyone, until Billy just confirmed there are 4. So what will we need to do? Asked Edward. Nothing for now, replied the professor. Later that day, Edward was busy repairing a fishing boat. He looked up to see a few local fishing boats casting their nets. Edward was thinking of Isabella and how she loved to watch the boats come ashore full of all different fish. Edward was about to carry on working on the boat when he looked up again and noticed some men in a small fishing boat casting a net. Anyone else watching would not think anything of it. But Edward noticed there were 5 men in the boat, not the normal 2 or 3 fishermen. Just then, the professor walked over to Edward and said, Do you need help with this boat? In a low voice, then said, Don't look too hard, my friend. You will get sore eyes. And yes, before you say anything, I noticed the 5 men in the fishing boat, and if you're thinking they are not fishermen, you are right. Carry on as normal. I will stay here for a while with you. I need to work out what sort of reason they have for being here. The 2 men carried on repairing the boat when Billy and his wife approached them. Professor, Master Edward, we will be going to the farm for a few days to check the crops. Very good, Billy. And while you are there, remember to try the new water system we set up the other week, replied Edward. I will, sir, and thank you for all you have done on the farm, especially getting the best prices for my produce, remarked Billy. Think nothing of it, Billy. I'm very happy to help in any way, replied Edward. Billy shook Edward and the professor's hands and left for the farm with his wife. We can expect the men on the hill to make their move any time now, so we need to carry on as if nothing is wrong and stick to the plan. As long as we have the advantage, we will be fine, said the professor. I don't think they will do anything while everyone is in the village, Edward remarked. No, but there is a festival in 2 days. Everyone will be in the town celebrating, said the professor. So for now, we act normal and just carry on as if it is just another day. It is the day of the festival. We will need to keep our eyes and ears open to anything and everything not normal. Like before, but without watching a grown man play like a child, laughed Edward. That made the professor burst out laughing. No, not this time. I don't think that would work a second time, chuckled the professor. At Oakfield, the day was anything but normal. Sir Arthur had news a few days before that the Colombian government would not entertain the idea of Sir Arthur's plan to mine for gold and trade coffee. The plan to have sole trading rights for the sugar from Cuba has been put into place after a lot of bribes and promises. All the setbacks have been taking their toll on Sir Arthur, who is looking older and tired. It was a very cold and wet morning when Mary, soaking wet, ran into the house and saw Pete Turnbull. Hurry, master, Sir Arthur is outside in the rain and acting very strange, said Mary in a hurried voice. Turnbull and the butler rushed into the garden, where they saw Sir Arthur standing in the water fountain, dressed as Neptune, demanding the rain stop. They managed to get him out and wrap a coat around him. All the while he was telling the rain he was their god, and the rain must obey his command. Turnbull noticed Sir Arthur had been drinking, and was too drunk to even notice anyone was with him. They got Sir Arthur back to the house and dried him off before putting him to bed. Pete Turnbull called Mary and the butler into the kitchen and told them not to talk to anyone about what happened that day if they wished to continue to work and stay healthy. Both Mary and the butler knew exactly what Turnbull meant and agreed to say nothing. It was the next day Sir Arthur was back to his normal self, giving orders and generally being in a bad mood. He was in the study when Turnbull walked in with an unexpected visitor, and before Turnbull could introduce the guest, Sir Arthur raised his hands in the air and shouted, "My, you are a sight for sore eyes, and with good timing as well. How is my old friend the Fixer?" asked an excited Sir Arthur. Standing in front of Sir Arthur was the captain, but Sir Arthur only knew him as the Fixer, after all the deals the captain had done many years ago to gain Sir Arthur's trust. "I am well, thank you, Sir Arthur. I was in London, and went to ask for you, as I have a deal that may interest you. So I went to the house only to be told you are living here by your doorman, so here I am, ready to help my old friend make some money," replied the captain. "What a blessing. You have come at the right time. As a few deals out of my control fell apart, please sit down and let us talk about this plan of yours. I remember the last one. I made a lot of money out of that and managed to get my seat as a Member of Parliament from that as well. And all thanks to you, my friend." Pete Turnbull was surprised to see Sir Arthur in such an excitable mood. It was something he had never seen before, and to him, that meant this friend of Sir Arthur's could be trusted. If just merely walking into the room could make Sir Arthur behave like that. The two men sat and talked for over 2 hours when Sir Arthur called for the cook. Mary walked into the room. Sir Arthur said, "Mary, please prepare something very special for dinner. I have a very dear friend staying for a few days, and I would like him to have a taste of what the best meal in all of Surrey tastes like." Mary looked up and was surprised to see the captain sitting with Sir Arthur, but she showed no emotion. Mary said she would start right away on making something special for the occasion. That seemed to make Sir Arthur even more in a good mood. The two men carried on talking for a while, and then the captain produced a letter with a plan to buy some land which has gold waiting to be dug out of the mountains, as well as silver and copper. The land was in Australia and ready for the right buyer, and being under British rule and in his capacity as a Member of Parliament, it would be easy to obtain the land and keep all profit and not pay tax. Sir Arthur had an expression on his face as a child would after receiving his Christmas presents. He was happy and excited about the idea. "Now that is the way to go. I will have that land in my hands by the end of the week. Now tell me, what have you been up to after all these years?" asked Sir Arthur. The captain then started to talk about his adventures, always making sure it involved money and lots of it. He found many years ago that if you talk about money to Sir Arthur, he will listen intently. It was the day of the local festival, and the whole village dressed for the occasion and went into the town to celebrate, which meant Edward and the professor were alone in the village. It was about 2 in the afternoon when the professor told Edward to watch the back of the hut. It was only a few minutes before Edward said, "They are moving in this way from the tree line. There are 5, the professor said, "and those 5 in the fishing boat are moving onto the shore, so we have 10 to deal with. Keep a lookout from the sides." Edward and the professor moved to a side room with a trapdoor on the floor, ready to make a run for the trees. The men on the beach opened fire, a volley of shots at the hut, and both Edward and the professor dived to the floor. Then they heard men shouting and more shots fired. Then the sound of metal on metal. The professor looked at Edward, and both of them made a run for the trees. As they were running, the professor stopped and turned to see the men fighting with some other men. He called to Edward to stay in the trees. He then ran to the fighting, ready to cut a few men to the ground, when he saw another group of men running towards the fight. The situation looked hopeless until he heard some men shouting in Spanish and realized he had people fighting on his side. It was all over within minutes from the first shots fired. Still looking puzzled, he went over to the men who greeted him as an old friend. Still a little confused about what just happened, he started to look for the last man out of the 7 who was sent by Edward's father. A look of horror came across his face when he realized he was not among the dead. The professor turned and started to run as fast as he could towards where Edward was waiting. As he approached the trees, there was a loud crack, and he saw Edward stagger out of the trees holding a pistol. The professor ran up to Edward to see if he was all right. "I am fine, just a little shaken up." He came out of nowhere and was about to use his knife when there was a loud crack sound. The next thing I remember was him dropping to the ground with a hole in his head. "I must have pulled the trigger without thinking," said Edward. "That's all right, my friend. You can take the credit for the kill." Both the professor and Edward looked as if they had seen a ghost. "Otto, what the blazes are you doing here?" asked a shocked Edward. "My friend, did I not tell you before? Your friends in Colombia are looking out for you, as you are a very important asset to them. I arrived with a few of the president's men. He sent them to aid you in fighting for justice." The professor told Otto that if he had not turned up the way he did, both Edward and himself would probably be dead. The President would not let that happen, especially after what happened to you both the last time. When the President found out about the attack, he sent word to me to protect you without revealing myself, but today there was no choice. Well, you are a sight for sore eyes, Otto, and this is a day I will never forget what you did for us, replied Edward. They moved the bodies into a few boats, and then the Colombian men took them out to sea to dispose of the bodies. Otto told Edward and the professor to be ready to set sail for England in the morning. How is that possible? Edward is still a wanted man in England, thanks to his father, said the professor. There have been a few changes, and all for the good, I hasten to add. But for now I can tell you that Edward is no longer a wanted man, but we still need to be careful, as we don't know who else has been paid to kill Edward, replied Otto. Back at the hotel, Isabella and John were enjoying talking and remembering the happy times everyone had when Lady Margaret was alive. John, I've often wondered why you stayed at Oakfield for so long, asked Isabella. John smiled and said, after Lady Margaret's brother died, the captain and I were packing his things to ship home when there were 3 letters in a writing box, one for Lady Margaret, one for the captain, and one for me. In my letter, your father asked me to stay with Lady Margaret, so I could protect you until I knew you would no longer need my protection. Is that why you never married? Asked a giggling Isabella. This made John blush. My work kept me busy, and so did you when you were very young, making me chase you all around the house and spending hours looking for you in the garden, while all the time you were in the kitchen eating pie or cake, laughed John. This made Isabella laugh even more, and then she said, I always thought you and Mary would marry. I know she is sweet on you, and you are sweet on her, but neither of you makes it obvious. Mary is a fine woman, and would make any man a happy man, replied John. Then make that man you, Master John. You are perfect for each other, said an excited Isabella. John changed the subject to talk about her and Edward's plans for the future. I would love to go back to Oakfield and enjoy knowing Lady Margaret can rest in peace with Edward and myself there, and not Edward's devil of a father, but I must admit, being in Jamaica with Edward, I felt I was home and very happy to just enjoy life without thinking what to wear or which hat is in fashion. It is a good life, I will agree, Miss Isabella, and one I am thinking of doing myself once this messy business is over, replied John. At that moment there was a knock at the door. John told Isabella to go into the other room. John opened the door and was greeted by a very well-dressed man, who presented himself as the secretary to Prince Albert, and then handed John a leather pouch, told John that he will return in 1 hour to collect the documents. John shut the door and called Isabella into the room. It looks like we have something from Prince Albert. John opened the pouch, untied the seal, and began to read. Then after a few minutes turned to Isabella and said, Edward is no longer a wanted man for breaking our government's trade agreement with Spain, as the trade was part of a deal with the Colombian government towards independence. The document also states that as soon as it is possible, Oakfield Manor and the estate are to be returned to Isabella Lowings, daughter to Lord Henry Oakfield and adopted daughter of the late Lady Margaret, now the said wife of Edward Lowings. Isabella Lowings from this day has been bestowed the title of Lady Isabella. I don't believe what I am hearing. I am now the Lady of Oakfield Manor. Edward is no longer a wanted man. Lady Margaret is still looking after me, Isabella said in a shocked but emotional voice. There is more, in recognition for many years of service to the Crown and its government. John Hamilton will be given a pension of no less than £10,000 a year for life, and will be known from this day forward as Sir John, after the formalities. John looked up and was visibly shocked. I haven't done anything to deserve any of this. I'm not part of the gentry. I will be like a fish out of water, remarked John. Now, Sir John, that's not the attitude, laughed Isabella. John went red just hearing the words, Sir John. I can't accept this, Miss Isabella. I am not of high breeding. Neither was that Sir Arthur, but he managed it, and so can you. Think of how proud Lady Margaret would be if she was here now, replied Isabella. There is one thing I want to know that has confused me for a long time. What is the connection between Lady Margaret, the ring, and the prince? Asked Isabella. John looked at Isabella as if he had been waiting for this question. It started many years ago when your father was a child. His mother was one of the best governess, teaching everything from reading and writing to Latin, and the prince was one of her students. Your father was 3 years older than the prince, but used to help the prince with his schoolwork. They became great friends, but more like brothers than friends. From what I remember, your father was 18 when he joined the army as a low-ranking officer. The prince had 2 identical rings made, one for your father and one for himself. Your father once told me that the ring symbolized a true bond of brotherhood. Now I understand why the ring was so special to Lady Margaret, because of the bond between the prince and her brother. Both Isabella and John signed the document and returned the pouch when the prince's secretary arrived. It was exactly 1 hour when there was a knock at the door. The same man was standing there with his hand open, waiting for the document. John passed it over. The man checked to see if it was signed. He gave a slight smile, and then handed John a second document. But this time the man simply turned around and left. John closed the door and began to read. "What is this one about, John?" asked Isabella. "What it is saying is that Sir John Hamilton will be the new British governor of Jamaica, starting in the new year." "That is amazing news, John, and it also starts you off on your dream of living there. Will you take Mary with you?" asked an excited Isabella. John laughed. "One thing at a time," he said. They then carried on talking about what just happened and what the future has in store for them. The captain was getting ready to go down for breakfast when he looked out of the window and noticed Sir Arthur outside. It looked like he was talking to himself while pacing up and down when suddenly Sir Arthur was shouting at someone, but there was no one there. The captain heard Sir Arthur shout, "Leave me alone. You are dead, and your soul is in the river. Go away. Don't make me have you killed again." Then there was silence when Turnbull went to help Sir Arthur back into the house. The captain entered the breakfast room and found Sir Arthur sitting there waiting for him, and in a jolly mood. "Please sit and have some of this wonderful coffee, and do help yourself to anything you wish to eat. I have a feeling that today will be a good day." "I do believe it will be, judging by your good mood, Sir Arthur," replied the captain. The 2 men talked for an hour, then walked in the garden. It was a crisp winter morning. The ground was covered in frost, making a cracking sound underfoot when walking. They had walked for about 20 minutes when Sir Arthur stopped and pointed to the family crypt. "There is the resting place of the most stubborn woman I have ever known," remarked Sir Arthur, who went on to say, "I had a lot of people depending on her selling some land in Norfolk, but she was stubborn right from the start, until the day she died." The captain asked, "So the lady died of old age?" "You could say that, but sometimes you have to give God a helping hand to get what you want," said Sir Arthur with a laugh. The captain had to use all his strength not to do anything rash after hearing this. "Let us return to the house and see if we can find another money-making idea between us, just like we had done in the past," said Sir Arthur. The 2 men returned to the house to work on new ideas to make more money for Sir Arthur and his gentleman's club. It was around 3 in the afternoon when they were interrupted by Pete Turnbull with a message for Sir Arthur. "Sir, I have just received word from my man in London. May I have a word with you in private, sir?" "You can talk freely in front of my friend. If it's bad news or good, my friend will find a way to resolve any issues regarding problems," replied Sir Arthur. "As you wish, sir. I have been told that some of the investors have backed out and demanding the money back," Turnbull said in an agitated voice. "So a few backed out, it is not a problem. We can cover what we will lose from a few of them backing out. It is them who will regret their decision later when we make a fortune," said Sir Arthur, laughing. "How many did we lose?" Turnbull did not feel comfortable telling Sir Arthur exactly how many wanted their money back. "All told, with those from Parliament and the bank, 15, said Turnbull. Sir Arthur went white as a sheet. On hearing how many had backed out of his plans, Sir Arthur's face changed from laughter to anger. He stood up and in a rage shouted, 15! Who are they? And why now are they all backing out at the same time?" "I have a list of names ready for you, sir," said a very worried Turnbull. Sir Arthur looked at the names and turned to Turnbull. "It looks like there will be a lot of accidents from now and the new year. See to it, Turnbull. You know the best ways when dealing with these types of people," said an angry Sir Arthur. It was then the captain said, "Sir Arthur, if you do that just after you received the news, it could fall back on you. There only needs to be a few accidents to happen to make the others talk, which could bring suspicion to your door." Sir Arthur sat down, then said, "You are right, my friend. It will come back to me if the others talk. I apologize. I was not thinking straight." The captain deep inside was smiling. The plan to have Carl explain to the 15 investors what would happen to them if they continued to invest with Sir Arthur had worked. The captain had noticed a change in Sir Arthur now and then. One moment he was fine, the next he would do something rash, like talk to a chair or try to catch a fish with a spoon. It seems Sir Arthur comes and goes in and out of these moments, and it seems since Sir Arthur received the news about the investors backing out of his plan, the refusal of trade of gold and coffee from Colombia, the death of the King of Spain, all together seems to be too much for him. But then, when Sir Arthur is feeling good, he is twice as determined to find a new way to make money and to stop his gentleman's club falling apart. The captain has been staying at Oakfield now for 3 days, and today Sir Arthur will be in a good mood, as this is the day he will have the land in Australia in his hands. Sir Arthur has already made plans for a few of Pete Turnbull's men to go to Australia, with money to set up a mining camp and hire some local men to dig the mines. It was early morning when Sir Arthur heard the news he had got the land in Australia. This made him very happy. It made him that happy he gave the captain a gold pocket watch as a thank you. Both the captain and Sir Arthur were in the study, celebrating getting the land in Australia. "Well, my dear friend, you pulled it off again by passing me information that will help fill my pockets with gold," said a delighted Sir Arthur. "I knew this was right for you from the moment I found out the land was for sale," replied the captain. "This calls for a celebration feast with the best food for such an occasion. I would like you to try a delightful dish that Mary has been making for me for months. It has my favorite mushrooms and the best ingredients that nature has to offer, with the best lamb cuts." "I would like to try that, Sir Arthur. It sounds very appetizing. It is almost making me hungry thinking about it." This made both men burst out laughing. Edward and the Professor were ready for the journey back to England and were waiting for Billy to return to say their goodbyes. Billy arrived an hour before the ship's departure. "Master Edward, I heard what happened and was happy to hear you and the Professor were unharmed. Yes, it was fate that night that kept the Professor and myself safe. Now, Billy, I will be back one day, but before then, I have left something for you and your wife in the hut. It is my way of saying thank you for everything," said a very grateful Edward. The 3 men shook hands, and then Edward and the Professor boarded the ship. Otto was already waiting for them on deck. "Gentlemen, are you ready to go back to England with your heads held high?" asked Otto. "Yes, but more importantly, I can hold my wife in my arms once more and look into her eyes and tell her how much I love her," replied Edward. The ship had been at sea for a few days, and in that time the 3 men talked a lot about what had happened in England and Jamaica. Otto told Edward about his father's plan to take over the coffee and gold trade in Colombia, using Edward's permission document signed by the Colombian president, and how the president said no to all offers from Edward's father. Otto went on to tell Edward and the Professor how the captain had made a plan to bring his Sir Arthur to justice, but not for the death of Lady Margaret or anyone else's deaths he may have had a hand in. There was no real evidence to use that against him. Otto went on to give a list of crimes Sir Arthur was involved with that could be used against him. The list ranged from abusing his power as a member of the Parliament to forcibly taking land and using the Bank of England as his very own moneymaker, using blackmail and fear in doing so. The Professor turned to Edward and said, "What I am about to tell you is going to hurt very much and cause you to be very angry, but the captain said you will need to know when the time is right." Edward looked shocked on hearing those words. "What is it that could make me hurt so badly and angry?" replied Edward. "Almost a year to this very day the captain and John came to see me near the docks. They were looking for someone. That person just happened to use opium, and this excuse for a man was in the same building when they came to see me. He died from taking too much opium, but not before he was able to point to his coat. In the coat was a letter that was not signed or mentioned any names. The captain, John and I believe your father was not only responsible for the death of Lady Margaret, but also his first wife. We believe after meeting your mother and making her fall in love with him, he tried to divorce his first wife to marry your mother, but she would not give him a divorce, and a few days later she died in a fire while asleep. I can't believe what I'm hearing, but in a way I'm not surprised," remarked Edward. The Professor went on to say, "Edward, there is a very strong possibility that in some way your father is responsible for your mother's death. It was strange that your father came into possession your mother's estate in Germany and had control of your mother's family's money, only a few days after your mother's death. Edward had a look of anger about him when he heard his father may have killed his mother. It was a look neither Otto nor the Professor had seen before. Edward said in an angry voice, "If he did have anything to do with my mother's death, I will personally put the rope around his neck and pull the lever."
I just wanna love you, just wanna hold